No animal in human mythology carries more contradictory meaning than the serpent. Walk into a hospital anywhere in the modern world, and you will find its image on the wall, on the ambulance, on the badge of the physician, a snake wound around a staff, the ancient symbol of healing itself. Open the book of Genesis, and the serpent is the reason humanity was expelled from paradise, the origin of shame, labor, and death. Travel to India, and the serpent becomes Shesha, the cosmic being upon whose coils the god Vishnu rests between the destruction and creation of universes, not a threat to cosmic order, but its very foundation. Look at an alchemical manuscript from medieval Europe or a temple carving from ancient Egypt, and you will find a snake eating its own tail, representing not chaos, but eternity, the perfect closed cycle of time itself. The same animal, legless, cold-blooded, capable of shedding its own skin and emerging apparently reborn, has been humanity's symbol of medicine and poison, wisdom and deception, the sacred feminine and the ultimate enemy, sometimes within the same civilization, sometimes within the very same text. Why does one creature carry this entire spectrum of meaning when other animals in mythology tend to settle into a single role? What is it about the serpent, specifically, that made every human civilization look at it and see something too large, too ambiguous, too genuinely uncanny to fit into an ordinary category of good or evil? Begin with the meaning most visible in the modern world, because it survives, largely unexamined, in daily life: the serpent as healer. The rod of Asclepius, a single snake coiled around a wooden staff, has represented medicine since at least the 5th century BCE, when Asclepius, the Greek god of healing, was worshipped at sanctuaries across the Greek world, most famously at Epidaurus, where sick pilgrims would sleep overnight in a ritual practice called incubation, hoping the god would appear to them in dreams, sometimes in the form of a serpent, and either heal them directly or reveal the treatment they required. Non-venomous snakes, likely the Asclepian snake still found across parts of Europe, were kept living within these healing sanctuaries, allowed to move freely among the patients. Understood not as a danger to be avoided, but as a physical manifestation of the healing god's presence. Why would a species, terrified of venomous bites, choose the snake, of all animals, as the emblem of medicine? And the most persuasive answer lies in the snake's single most distinctive biological behavior: ecdysis, the shedding of its skin. A snake does not simply grow the way a mammal does. Periodically, its entire outer skin splits and is shed whole, revealing a new, brighter skin beneath, in a process that looks, to any observer without modern biological knowledge, exactly like death and rebirth performed on the animal's own body repeatedly throughout its life. No other commonly encountered animal offers this direct, visible, repeatable demonstration of apparent renewal. A snake that has just shed its skin looks, quite literally, reborn. For a species desperately searching for evidence that decay and death are not necessarily final, that the body could somehow renew itself the way the snake so visibly does, the serpent became the most natural possible symbol of medicine's deepest promise, not merely the treatment of illness, but the reversal of decline itself, the shedding of the old, damaged self in favor of a restored one. And yet this same biological fact, the serpent's uncanny capacity for renewal, produces the opposite meaning just as readily, because a creature that appears to defeat death naturally becomes an object of both reverence and profound anxiety, depending entirely on whether that power is understood to be shared with humanity or withheld from it. This is precisely the tension at the center of the Genesis narrative, one of the most consequential serpent stories ever told. In the Garden of Eden, the serpent, described as more crafty than any other creature God had made, approaches Eve at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and tells her, directly contradicting God's warning, that she will not die if she eats its fruit, that her eyes will instead be opened, and she will become like God, knowing good and evil. The The serpent, remarkably, is telling the truth on both counts. Eve does not die immediately, and Genesis explicitly confirms that the fruit does grant a form of divine knowledge, since God subsequently states that the humans have indeed become like the divine beings, knowing good and evil. What the serpent conceals, or perhaps genuinely does not disclose, is the cost: the loss of unearned innocence, expulsion from the garden, and the introduction of mortality, labor, and pain as the permanent condition of human life going forward. Ancient Near Eastern scholars have long noted that the Genesis serpent inherits imagery from a broader regional tradition in which serpents were already closely associated with both wisdom and the specific, tantalizing possibility of immortality, a connection made explicit in the roughly contemporary epic of Gilgamesh, where Gilgamesh, after finally obtaining a plant capable of restoring youth, has it stolen directly out of his hands by a serpent while he bathes, the snake immediately shedding its skin as proof of the plant's power working exactly as promised, snatching away the one chance at renewed life that the human hero had traveled to the ends of the earth to secure. In both the Mesopotamian and Hebrew traditions, then, the serpent is directly, explicitly connected to the very thing humans want most and cannot have. The renewal the animal performs constantly on its own body becomes, from the human perspective, something stolen, withheld, or offered only at a devastating price. In Egypt, this same duality does not merely coexist across separate stories, as in the biblical tradition drawing on Gilgamesh, but is embedded within the state religion itself as two entirely opposed serpent figures operating simultaneously at the highest level of Egyptian cosmology. The uraeus, the rearing cobra depicted on the crown of every pharaoh, spitting fire and poison at the ruler's enemies, represents the goddess Wadjet, protector of Lower Egypt and, by extension, the divine authority and protective power of the pharaoh himself, a serpent so thoroughly identified with legitimate sovereignty that no image of Egyptian royal power is considered complete without it. At the same moment, in the same theological system, Apophis, sometimes called Apep, is depicted as a colossal serpent of chaos who attacks the sun god Ra's bark every single night as it travels through the underworld, requiring the combined efforts of Ra's entire divine crew, including the god Set in his role as protector, to repel the serpent's assault and ensure the sun rises again the following morning. Temple rituals across Egypt included the daily symbolic destruction of Apophis, priests reciting curses over wax or papyrus, images of the serpent before burning, cutting, or spitting upon them, treating the maintenance of cosmic order as something requiring active, repeated ritual combat against serpentine chaos. The uraeus protects, Apophis threatens annihilation. Both are serpents, both are central to core Egyptian theology, and the Egyptians felt no particular need to resolve this apparent contradiction into a single, simplified serpent symbolism, because for a civilization organized around the daily, anxious maintenance of cosmic order against constant threat, a single animal genuinely could represent both the protective power wielded by legitimate authority and the chaotic threat that authority existed specifically to repel. Cross into India, and the serpent achieves perhaps its most unambiguously exalted status in any major world tradition, appearing not as an ambiguous or contested figure, but as a direct, structural support of cosmic order itself. Shesha, whose name means remainder or that which remains, is described in Hindu texts as an enormous naga, a serpent being of 1,000 heads, upon whose coiled body the god Vishnu reclines and rests during the intervals between the dissolution of one universe and the creation of the next, floating on the cosmic ocean while Vishnu sleeps and dreams the next cycle of existence into being, as discussed in the broader tradition of Hindu cyclical cosmology. Shesha's name, remainder, points to a genuinely striking theological concept. This serpent represents what persists when everything else, including the physical universe itself, has been dissolved and has not yet been recreated. Alongside Shesha, the broader category of Naga's serpent beings, often depicted as multi-headed cobras capable of assuming human form, associated with water, treasure, and the protection of sacred sites and sacred teachings, occupies a consistently positive, protective role across Hindu and Buddhist tradition, with Naga kings guarding Buddhist relics, sheltering meditating Buddhas beneath their spreading hoods during storms, and controlling the monsoon rains upon which agricultural civilization directly depends. Why did Indian civilization arrive at such a consistently exalted serpent theology when neighboring traditions oscillated so dramatically between reverence and horror? Part of the answer likely lies in India's genuine ecological relationship with snakes. Agricultural communities, dependent on grain storage, benefit enormously from snake populations that prey on the rodents, which would otherwise destroy stored harvests. And a civilization that directly experienced snakes as protectors of the food supply, rather than merely as venomous threats encountered occasionally in the wild, had concrete, observable reasons to develop a theology of the serpent as fundamentally protective and beneficial rather than fundamentally dangerous. In Mesoamerica, the serpent achieves a synthesis unlike anything in the Old World traditions surveyed so far through the figure of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent whose composite form, a snake's body, combined with the brilliant plumage of the Quetzal bird, was already discussed in the context of dragon mythology as a creature uniting earth and sky, the crawling and the flying, into a single symbolic being. What deserves further attention here is specifically the serpent half of that composite, because Mesoamerican civilizations independently arrived at an association between serpents and wisdom, learning, and civilizing knowledge that closely parallels developments in the Old World despite total geographic isolation. Quetzalcoatl, in his role as culture bringer, is credited across Aztec, Toltec, and earlier Mesoamerican tradition with teaching humanity agriculture, the calendar, writing, and the arts of civilized life, a serpent-associated deity functioning in this specific respect remarkably similarly to the culture-bringing, knowledge-granting role played by serpents elsewhere in world mythology, arrived at through entirely independent cultural development on an entirely separate continent. The Ouroboros, the image of a serpent or dragon consuming its own tail, forming a perfect closed circle, represents perhaps the most abstract and philosophically loaded serpent symbol in the ancient world, and one whose earliest known appearance, in the Egyptian enigmatic book of the Netherworld, found inscribed in the tomb of Tutankhamun around 1350 BCE, already carries its mature symbolic meaning. The serpent eating its own tail as a representation of the unified, cyclical totality of time and existence, without beginning or end. The symbol subsequently appears independently across Greek philosophical and alchemical traditions, where it becomes closely associated with the concept of hen to pan, the one, the idea that all apparent opposites, all apparent divisions within existence, ultimately resolve into a single, self-sustaining, self-consuming totality. Medieval and Renaissance alchemists adopted the Ouroboros as perhaps their single most important symbol, representing the alchemical process itself, matter breaking down, consuming its own prior form, in order to be transformed into something new, the destruction and the creation understood as a single continuous process rather than two separate events. What makes the Ouroboros distinct from every other serpent symbol discussed here is its complete removal from any specific narrative. It is not a character who acts within a story, tempting, healing, guarding, or threatening. It is a diagram, a piece of pure philosophical shorthand, in which the serpent's two defining and superficially contradictory qualities, the capacity to consume, to destroy, to poison, combined with the capacity to shed and renew itself, are fused into a single continuous image representing the fundamental structure of reality itself. that creation and destruction are not opposites locked in combat, but two names for the exact same underlying process, viewed from different points along its endless circuit. In Australia, the Aboriginal tradition of the rainbow serpent, already discussed in relation to flood mythology and the dreaming, deserves attention here specifically for how it distributes creative and destructive power within a single serpentine figure without treating this as a contradiction requiring resolution at all. Across dozens of distinct Aboriginal language groups and traditions, the rainbow serpent is understood as a primordial ancestral being who moved across the once featureless land during the dreaming. Its passage carving out the riverbeds, waterholes, and mountain ranges of the actual physical landscape, making it directly, literally responsible for the fundamental geography that Aboriginal communities inhabit and navigate by. The same rainbow serpent, in numerous traditions, is also understood as a figure capable of catastrophic destruction, particularly through flooding, when sacred law is violated or improper behavior disturbs the order the serpent originally established. What is philosophically distinctive about this tradition, compared to the Egyptian solution of simply maintaining two entirely separate serpent deities for creation and chaos, is that the rainbow serpent's creative and destructive capacities are understood as the same power, exercised by the same being, depending entirely on whether human beings maintain or violate their obligations to the law the serpent established during its original creative journey. The serpent does not need to be split into a protective Urius and a hostile Apophis because in the Aboriginal framework, creation and destruction were never separate categories requiring separate deities to begin with. They are simply what happens when the same fundamental power is honored or dishonored. In West Africa, and carried across the Atlantic into the Vodou traditions of Haiti and the broader Caribbean, the serpent achieves yet another distinct theological role, centered on the figure of Dan, sometimes called Dambala or Danbala, one of the oldest and most revered spirits in the Fon and Ewe religious traditions of Benin and Togo, and subsequently one of the most important Loa in Haitian Vodou. Dan is consistently depicted as a great serpent, frequently paired with his wife Ada Wido, herself represented as a rainbow serpent whose curved form arcing across the sky after rain directly mirrors the visual logic of the Australian rainbow serpent tradition despite complete geographic separation between the two cultures. In faun cosmology, Dan is understood as the primordial life force that supports and encircles the entire created world, sometimes described as coiled around the earth itself to prevent it from collapsing. A serpent whose fundamental role is structural and supportive rather than either threatening or narrowly medicinal closer. In this specific respect, to Shesha's role beneath Vishnu, then to the more contested serpent figures of the Mediterranean world. In Haitian Vodou, where West African religious traditions were preserved, transformed, and syncretized with Catholic imagery under conditions of enslavement, Dambala became closely associated with the wisdom, purity, and primordial creative power, sometimes visually merged with representations of Catholic saints, particularly Saint Patrick, whose iconography traditionally includes snakes being driven from Ireland, repurposed within Vodou practice to honor rather than banish the serpent spirit. Practitioners possessed by Dambala during ceremony are traditionally described as moving with a fluid, undulating, serpentine motion, sometimes climbing structures head first in a manner mimicking snake locomotion, embodying directly, through the human body itself, the primordial serpent's characteristic movement. Once again, independently of the Hindu, Egyptian, and Australian traditions already discussed, an unconnected civilization arrived at the conclusion that a serpent, rather than any other animal, was the most appropriate symbol for the fundamental, supportive, life-sustaining structure underlying the entire visible world. So what accounts for this extraordinary breadth of meaning, spanning healing and poison, wisdom and deception, cosmic support, and cosmic chaos, all attached to a single kind of animal across civilizations with no possible contact? Carl Jung considered the serpent one of the most psychologically loaded symbols available to the human unconscious, precisely because it occupies a genuinely liminal biological category that resists easy classification. Legless yet mobile, cold-blooded yet capable of striking with startling speed and precision, living close to the earth yet frequently associated, as in the rainbow serpent, Damballa, and Quetzalcoatl traditions, with water, sky, and the highest cosmic functions. A creature that will not stay in one category invites a symbolism that will not stay in one category either. Jung went further still, arguing that the serpent frequently appears in dreams and mythology as a direct representation of the autonomous, instinctual, pre-rational layer of the psyche, something that moves according to its own ancient logic beneath and prior to conscious control, capable of either poisoning the conscious mind with fear and repression or, when properly integrated rather than denied, offering exactly the kind of transformative renewal the shedding skin so visibly performs. This is why, Jung suggested, the serpent so consistently resists being permanently classified as simply good or simply evil across the traditions that engage with it seriously. The unconscious itself is not moral in the way conscious judgment is, and a symbol drawn directly from that deeper layer of the mind will inevitably carry the same fundamental ambivalence, refusing the tidy resolution that a more domesticated symbol might allow. But the biological fact of ecdysis, of visible skin shedding, deserves particular weight in any explanation that hopes to move beyond psychology alone, because it is the one observable behavior common to the vast majority of serpent symbolism across every tradition surveyed here. Whether the specific cultural conclusion drawn from that behavior was healing, immortality, wisdom, or theft, every civilization that encountered snakes watched the same biological process, the old skin splitting, sliding free, revealing something new and brighter beneath, and recognized in it a demonstration, performed directly on the animal's own body, of the single transformation every human being wants most and cannot achieve, to shed what is old, damaged, and dying, and emerge, whole and renewed, on the other side. The Greeks built temples around this promise. The Hebrews wrote a warning around its price. The Egyptians split it into a protector and a destroyer. The Hindus made it the literal floor beneath existence. The Aboriginal, Faun, and Mesoamerican traditions folded creation and destruction into the same coiled body without ever needing to separate them. Every one of these civilizations was looking at the same small, ordinary miracle happening in the grass and the desert and the riverbank around them, and every one of them concluded, independently, that an animal capable of appearing to defeat death on its own skin deserved to carry the weight of humanity's oldest, least resolved question, whether renewal, in the end, is something to be trusted.